welcome everybody to my talk on the Resquin tool, which is part of the KODAQS Toolbox, which has already been introduced by Dorothy briefly. And Resquin addresses response quality in multi-item scales, shows how to assess them, how to maybe mitigate them, or how to address them in further substantial analysis. Okay, then first to introduce myself here, I am the coordinator of this so-called KODAQS Data Quality Toolbox that hosts all these interesting tools that have also been presented in the weeks before in this Meet the Expert series, and I think in the upcoming weeks there will also be some more talks on further interesting tools. And I'm also responsible for the content creation of the survey data tools. So in the KODAQS Toolbox, we are hosting several tools, first for survey data, then also for digital behavioral data, and for linked data sets. And I'm responsible for the survey data tools there specifically. For my background as a researcher, I am a survey methodologist, and I'm interested in studying measurement error in survey data and other data types, for example, digital trace data. I also did a lot regarding response quality or broader data quality in panel studies, and I'm interested in quality assessments for data integration. And if you're interested or want to connect or whatever, you can reach me via my GESIS email. Okay, so then to first give you a quick overview of what I'm gonna talk about today. So first I'm gonna introduce some basic response quality concepts and indicators that are out there in the literature. Among those, very, very popular, the total survey error. I'm going to talk more conceptually or more theoretically about measurement error. I'm going to introduce the cognitive response process, that is basically the foundation of this all. Then I'm also going to talk about certain response strategies or response styles, survey satisficing and other specific response styles. Before I will then come to the Resquin tool and show you what kind of response quality indicators we use or we apply in the Resquin tool. Also, I'm going to show you the application example of our tool, and I'm going to give you a short demonstration of what it actually offers, what kind of functionalities are there. Okay, then to start, so why should we be even concerned about response quality? And to begin, or like to give kind of like an entry into the topic, I want to present here the total survey error framework, which is a very established framework in survey research. I'm sure everybody involved in survey research somehow knows it. And it kind of introduces the concept that there's error in data and survey data, which is basically the deviation of a survey response from its true underlying value in the population. And the total survey error then is the accumulation of all that error that may arise in different stages of the data collection process. And the total survey error itself then also classifies according to these different stages, these different error sources that can arise, the different quality issues that may arise when you deal with survey data. So broadly speaking, it is categorized into two dimensions, let's say. First of all, it's the measurement dimension, observational errors dimension. And on the other hand, we have the representation dimension, or the dimension of errors of non-observation. So what that basically means is, when we first turn to the representation dimension, is that these are errors that may arise from not observing specific respondents or specific units that are actually in your target population. And for example, what we see here is non-response error, which is like a very prominent error source, and this arises when you have respondents those respondents who reply to your survey or who complete your survey are systematically different from the ones that don't, from the ones that you basically don't get an answer from, don't get information from. And on the measurement dimension, we can also see that we have like different error sources here, just to pick out one. We are going to talk about another one in more detail, but just to pick out validity here as a short example. So validity or specification error refers to the problem that oftentimes when you ask questions, they may not really properly capture the intended theoretical construct that you want to find out something about. And then, as you can see, We also have measurement error, which is which happens or which is located at this intersection of measurement with an instrument or with a question and the given response that you get from surveying respondents or other units. And we are basically we are located, when we look at the total survey error framework, we are located at this intersection. We are looking at measurement error in specifically today in this talk. Okay, so to talk a bit more, to kind of like give you the background on measurement error. So by definition, what it actually means is that it's like the discrepancy between a respondent's answer and their true underlying attitudes, behaviors, or other traits or characteristics. And measurement error can either describe random error, which is just a random variability in a survey estimate over multiple replications. So if you like repeat surveying that person with the same question over and over, you might get like a different response, a different measurement due to random variability. This could be, for example, a technical error when we talk about web surveys, or for example, a person like mistakenly clicking in a web survey the wrong response option, for example. But then we also have, as another category here, systematic bias, and that describes the systematic deviation from the true value in the population. That means it really goes into a systematic direction. For example, if we think of the phenomenon of social desirability bias. So here we have like somewhere a systematic bias regarding the reporting of stigmatized behavior, for example. There are different sources of measurement error, which kind of like all overlap a bit. They cannot be clearly differentiated, as sometimes they also amplify measurement error from another source. But just also to give you like the background on this. So first of all, of course, the questionnaire itself can be a source of measurement error. That is, if we have like poorly constructed questions, if we have highly complex questions that can trigger measurement error there. Then we have the respondent level, which we are going to focus on basically today in the talk, so I'm going to come to that later. We also have the interviewer as a source of measurement error, so basically how the interviewer interacts with the respondent, how he maybe probes the respondent at given responses, if he follows the guidelines for interviewers, if he is interviewing the person in a structured way. And then also we have the survey mode, which is also something sometimes or very often kind of like amplifies measurement error from other sources. If we again think of social desirability bias, especially in interviewer administered surveys, this can be very amplified because you also have like the personal contact between two people, and for example in web surveys they are perceived as more anonymous, and therefore social desirability bias, which is a measurement error from the respondent, can also be amplified or mitigated, for example. Okay, so now the question is, how can measurement error actually arise? I mean, we learned about the sources, but what is the process that they arise from? And here it's important to know about the cognitive response process, also a very established concept in survey research. I'm sure a lot may know it, and that basically describes that we have like 4 stages of producing an answer to a survey question, of which the first is comprehension. And that means basically how does a respondent comprehend the question, how does he interpret it, what is needed from him, what the question asks about. And for example, if questions are complex, if they're ambiguously worded or whatever, there can be a misinterpretation of these questions. They can remain unclear to the respondent, and this can lead to some sort of measurement error. The next stage is the retrieval stage. So what that means is that respondents, after understanding the questions, then recall relevant information from their memory regarding forming an answer for that question. And here there's a potential for recall issues, for example. If a question asks about events that are way in the past, or maybe about routine activities that respondents are not really aware about how often they do them or to which extent they do them. So this is a very common measurement error that can arise at the retrieval stage. Then the judgment as the third and next stage, which basically just means that the respondent arrives at an answer or formulates an answer based on the retrieved information. And here the judgment stage can also be disrupted by, for example, low motivation, or also an incomplete retrieval when retrieval was not done properly or when it could not have been done properly. And this may lead then to shortcuts in making a judgment about the question, and therefore maybe respondents use heuristics to arrive at a judgment or at a response. And then lastly, the last stage is then the response stage, which basically describes that a respondent then maps the judgment that he formed onto the response options that are there. And here at the last stage, there's also potential for measurement error. A very classic one is that respondents may edit the response before they report. So even if they kind of like went all through these stages before and they have like their judgment and their proper response to a question, they may still choose to edit it, to adapt it, to maybe not report it fully. For example, because of, again, social desirability bias. So maybe they know how often they perform a stigmatized behavior, but they choose to edit and adapt that response to not reveal this undesirable information about themselves. Okay, so next we are coming to survey satisficing. Survey satisficing regarding the response process describes these potential disruptions that can happen in the response process. By definition speaking, survey satisficing describes very generally just mental shortcuts that can happen in the response process, and these mental shortcuts are taken by respondents to reduce cognitive effort and survey burden. According to the theory of John Krosnick, there are three key predictors for the occurrence and the extent of satisficing. First of all, it's the task difficulty. I think we already talked about this a bit. So when a question is very complex, very long, very tiring, burdensome. Second, respondent motivation. So if a respondent is just inherently low motivated, or if the questionnaire is so long that motivation declines. Third, there's respondent ability, so that is really referring to how able is the respondent also to process questions and answer to them. And this little formula that you see at the end of the slide just basically shows you or gives you an idea in which direction these three key predictors affect satisficing. So if task difficulty is really high, then satisficing is also high. But if respondent motivation and ability is high, then on the other hand, satisficing decreases or should decrease by theory. When we come to, or when we think of indicators of satisficing, there is a differentiation made between weak satisficing and strong satisficing. When we talk about weak satisficing, it means that the stages of the cognitive response process that I presented earlier are completed, but they are only completed with minimal effort or very superficially. And when respondents do that, there are several response strategies, or this weak satisficing can manifest itself in different response strategies. They include, for example, acquiescence, which is an agreement bias, meaning that respondents tend to agree with statements instead of coming up with arguments why they would not agree with a given statement. Second, primacy effects, which means that they choose the first option in a vertical response scale, just because it's like visually the first prominent option given. And third, for example, midpoint or neutral responding. So if you think of a scale from like totally disagree to totally agree and there's a midpoint, then respondents just tend to give a very neutral response because they don't want to think about it in more depth. With strong satisficing, it's a little bit different because there really one or multiple stages of the cognitive response process are skipped completely. And when respondents do that, there are different response strategies that can show. First of all, straight lining, which is in these multi-item scales that we are also talking about today. Basically, respondents just select the same response option through the different items, through the different questions. Another example would be selecting don't know or selecting another no opinion response option. Third, it can also be random responding, like really just randomly giving answers. Again, when we think of like multi-item scales, it can happen that they have like some kind of a zigzag pattern, which means like it's like very random. And lastly, also speeding, which means that respondents are so fast in responding the answer that they like almost impossibly really were able to process the question correctly. Okay, here I just want to give a brief overview of how satisficing was investigated in the past. It comes from a systematic review of Caroline Roberts, and here these tables just are supposed to give an overview of the different indicators of satisficing or response strategies of satisficing have been looked at, how often there were really effects found that are consistent with theory or contradicting the theory, and then also on the right-handed side to give an idea of how these key predictors, these three key predictors of satisficing, meaning task difficulty, respondent ability, and respondent motivation, how they can actually be measured, or how they were measured also in the literature. Okay, now turning to multi-item scales, which we are going to talk about because Resquin looks at response quality particularly in multi-item scales. So multi-item scales by definition are a set of survey questions, which we call items, and they measure the same underlying theoretical construct. So they are very common in measuring attitudes, values, personality traits, for example. And these multiple items, they share the same response scale. Often we see Likert scales. Often we see them like in terms of like disagreement, agreement scales. And the graph on the right-hand side basically just shows how the process takes place, let's say. So first of all, we have a theoretical concept, let's say maybe something like psychological self-worth, and then there is like the latent construct, something that we cannot observe, for example, self-esteem in that sense, and then we have different indicators which are measurable via questions, and then we use questions or these items to measure these indicators, and these questions are then, so let's say, the manifest part of it, so basically that part that we can actually really measure. Yeah, also to give you here a brief example of what I just explained. So here's an example for perceptions of welfare state consequences. So that is basically speaking the overall concept. And then we have like the latent traits of, or the latent construct of economic consequences, social consequences, moral consequences. And then with these like different questions, we can really, like as a manifest part here, can really measure, for example, or can approach these latent construct of economic consequences, social consequences, and so on, by asking really targeted questions as, for example, prevent widespread poverty as like an indicator for economic consequences. So moving on, the question now could be, okay, why is satisficing then actually a key risk in multi-item scales? So I here now put an example of a multi-item scale from the GESES panel POP in here. It is unfortunately in German, but just to give you an idea that, as you can already see, it's often that they are really long and complex batteries, and they can of course increase task difficulty and cognitive burden, which is something that we have now learned is something that can increase the probability or the occurrence of satisficing. At the same time, these different items have a shared response scale, and this can of course facilitate to skim answers overall. And then on top of it, some multi-item scales can have like really repetitive item formats, which also on top of that may induce fatigue. And as you can also see, or as this visual example on the right-hand side shows, this is also what research has shown, this especially applies for multi-item scales that are presented in these so-called grid or matrix formats, because this, of course, additionally imposes some visual burden to the respondent. Okay, now moving on to response styles, which we somehow already approached with the satisficing theory, but in the literature, response styles are being treated as stable personal dispositions to respond in a certain biased way. So they are basically trait-like. And exactly as like when we compare them to survey satisficing as a theory, they take more the stance of a trait-like, really personally stable characteristic disposition to, for example, use a certain response strategy, whereas survey satisficing takes more the stance of that this is like a more situational response strategy that respondents apply. So due to questionnaire length, due to task difficulty, question difficulty, respondents can just, through the situational circumstances, resort to different satisficing strategies as shortcuts. whereas the response styles assume that this is really within a person, kind of like stable. But these response styles, no matter, like, even if you look at them through the lens of service satisficing or as a stable personal disposition, they are most prevalent in multi-item scales, also for the reasons that I discussed before. And here we have kind of an overview of these response styles from a paper by Werenberg and Thomas. And I'm not going to discuss all of them. I'm just going to look in more detail at the ones that are also being covered by the Resquin tool. So first of all, we have here this acquiescence response style, which I already explained before. So it's basically the tendency to agree with items regardless of the content. So in this case, as we can also see with the third column here, if we have like a 7-point rating scale, this means that only the highest response categories are used. A second response style here that I want to emphasize is the middle response style, which is, again, I think I mentioned it before, the tendency to use the neutral response option, the middle response option, irrespective of the content. And the third one here that I want to highlight is the extreme response style, which means that respondents only use the highest or lowest response categories of a rating scale. Another response style or response strategy, which I also talked about before briefly, is straight lining. Just to give you now also a visual example of that. So as I mentioned before, straight lining is selecting the same response option across a set of items in a multi-item scale, for example. And here you can see two graphs which come from a paper from Neuert et al. From 2023. They are basically gaze plots of two different respondents in a large grid. This is not as important. What I just want to showcase with this is that, like, on the left-hand side of this graph, we can really clearly see a pattern of straight lining, where we can see that literally only one response option of the available response options was used, and this is essentially straight lining, as also explained before. Okay, lastly, I also want to give you a more broader overview of response quality indicators. So now we talked about response strategies through the lens of service satisficing and through stable personality traits as response styles. But there's also a paper by Bhakta et al., which really take many response quality indicators under consideration, and kind of also group them together under different categories. So for example, here we can also see that there are response indicators for response time. I mean, we also talked about it before, there's speeding, but there are like different ways of operationalizations that you can use. We also have like here focus on outlier indices, for example. So really looking at maybe unusual response patterns given on the outliers in the response distribution. Also, you can use paradata as response quality indicators, for example, keystroke measures. There's also, we have the consistency indices, which are more like, I think, focused on psychometric indicators, like consistency of in a multi-item scale, of answers in a multi-item scale, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that it would be about the background, the theoretical background, let's call it. But now, talking about the tool, what does it actually do? So the Resquin tool builds upon all of this, and it provides, to kind of sum it up, it provides replicable code for the calculation of response quality indicators to identify either random measurement error or systematic response biases. On top of this replicable code, it also provides guidance on how you can actually interpret the indicators that you calculate, and it gives you recommendations on how to handle certain data quality issues if they may arise, and also like how to move on if you want to conduct substantial analysis, how to move on with them if you find that you have data quality issues in your data. The Resquin tool is based on the Resquin R-package by Matthias Roth et al. You can also find it on GitHub, and it is also on Khan. And if you're more interested in this, you can also check that out. But now talking about the key quality indicators that Resquin covers. So Resquin covers, let's say, two categories of key quality indicators. One of them are response distribution indicators on the respondent level. They refer to the function in the Resquin R-package. RESP distributions, this is how you can get them when we talk like more about code and about the package itself. And basically what you can get with them, you also get other indicators, but what the Resquin tool uses is that it gives a proportion of missing responses, it gives the mean of multiple items per respondent, it gives the median across these multiple items in a scale per respondent, the standard deviation across items, and also the Mahalanobis distance. Now the Mahalanobis distance might not be as a straightforward measure or something that is commonly known. So also here in the tool, of course, we have a definition on this and also on other terms that we use and so on. So the Mahalanobis distance here, not here, also generally captures how different each respondent's pattern of answers is from the typical response pattern that you can see. So basically a high score indicates that respondents' answers are more unusual or inconsistent compared to the rest of the sample. And how we are using these response distribution indicators with Resquin is that we inspect missing values or these measures of central tendency and variability to kind of have an idea or get an idea if there is like unusual response pattern in the sample. And that can of course indicate random errors or systematic response biases. So how we use it is we use it as an initial response quality flag basically. Also to give like the users a feeling of like how these, like let's call them like more basic indicators, can already give you an idea of whether you have there might be data quality issues or there might be something wrong in your data. The second category then focuses on these response style indicators that I also discussed before. Again, on the respondent level, when we talk about the package or the functions, you can get them with this resp styles function. And the Resquin tool covers three of them, which is, as explained before, the middle response style, the acquiescence response style, and the extreme response style. The Resquin tool additionally, on top of that, also calculates an indicator for straight lining based on the standard deviation across items. So maybe if you maybe if you just like have something, or if you kind of assess the standard deviation across items, we also show you in the tool how to then calculate straight lining as an indicator for that. And this is like, let's say, more straightforward. So of course, by checking for systematic response styles, we get an idea of what may indicate poor quality responses in multi-item scales. Okay, so now on to the application case. So we assess response quality in multi-item scales by using two scales, one on political trust and the other one on environmental attitudes. You can see both of them here on the right side. So the political trust scale is a 10-item scale and uses a 7-point Likert response scale from don't trust at all to entirely trust. And this environmental attitude scale is an established scale with 15 items, so quite long. And it uses a 5-point Likert response scale from fully agree to fully disagree, so like a classic agreement-disagreement scale. So now, like, to give you more an idea about the functionalities of Resquin. So how does Resquin support response quality analysis? So first of all, which I think I already mentioned, it showcases the Resquin R-package on an application example. So you can really it walks you through the steps of how to apply the Resquin R-package on, let's say, like a use case or an application example. So basically it guides you through data preparation, it guides you through first data inspection, it guides you through the concrete application of it, and so on and so forth. Then as a second step, we also provide reusable code for example, diagnostic plots, how you can see, especially for these response distribution indicators, if something is very wrong, or not very wrong, but if there's a very unusual pattern in your data, so that you can really easily spot it. And we also provide interpretation of the indicators. Now I hope this works. I just also want to give you a short idea of how it looks in the tool. So basically here we kind of you can scroll yourself through, but for example here for the indicators of response distribution, we first of all give a summary table, but we also give you here replicable code for producing summary plots where you can really see very easily or nicely if there are like outliers in your data that may indicate unusual patterns. And as you can see here, we really in depth also provide interpretation of these indicators, what they mean, what this may imply, and so on and so forth. So this about like the application of the Resquin tool, but like more, let's say beyond, I called it and beyond, is that we also discuss common pitfalls in the analysis or the interpretation of key indicators. So as you can see here, they are like kind of highlighted with be careful paragraphs. And for example, we discuss how acquiescence response style should strictly speaking only be analyzed for actual agreement disagreement scales, because otherwise it doesn't have like, you cannot meaningfully interpret it, let's say. Then we also have like a little paragraph where we kind of explain a little bit more on the straight line indicator, give a little bit more background information on how not every time straight lining has to be a data quality issue, how it is really dependent on the context of the question, the content of the question, how it is designed, if it has like, for example, reversed worded item batteries, so that it is for sure like maybe more indicative of poor quality than in other questions. So we really provide also a lot of background information on that. And I think lastly, which is quite nice, is that we provide really practical recommendations for response quality analysis, so for dealing with data quality issues that you may find, and also for dealing with them if you actually have like further substantial analysis in mind that you want to do. Okay, so lastly, how can now Resquin contribute to overall response quality assessment? So here I just want to point out that in general, I think there's a lack of standardized measurement and workflows for assessing response quality. So I think especially if you compare it to the representation angle, there are like way more standards that exist, I think, for researchers. For example, if you think of APO reports, there's an APO report, I think, on data quality metrics for online panels, for example, and this is something that researchers and survey practitioners like resort to way more often, but these standardized or these standards are more missing for the measurement component. So here I think Resquin can contribute to the automatic assessment of certain indicators like we saw now, for example, straight lining, item non-response, acquiescence, midpoint responding, or extreme responding. But also to highlight this here again, even beyond indicators, when we think of response quality, measurement quality, it's always important, if you want to minimize random measurement error or systematic response biases, to also pay attention to questionnaire design. Evaluate your questionnaire design carefully. If you have the possibility, careful test your questions, for example, with cognitive interviews, web probing, to really also ensure that the questionnaire or the question itself don't trigger certain response styles or certain response strategies. And yes, that's it from me. Thanks a lot.